Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 247 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, I'm going to go over how I calculate the ore priorities for the different lines. Enjoy. Configuring this is kind of a pain. So I will show the process for, let's say, iron, and then I'll do the rest of it on my own, and I'll leave a comment with the exact numbers. So how the settings work is similar in concept to how we set up the input ores, where we have like a central repository warehouse, and the highest priority ores activate with the lowest number. So the highest priority, let's say of Givelite, is always on. And let's see if we can find it. It'll be the one that has nothing. And then, yeah, here we go. It's aluminum. So with aluminum, it's the best way of using Givelite and Crotinium, so there is no method to shut it off. In other words, its setting is, air quotes, 0. And then you have the least desirable methods increasing in number, like let's say 250. So if we are short on our Givelite chunks, as this number goes down from a high number to a low number, it's going to start shutting down various setups. So the less desirable the setup is, the higher the number is. And that's because it's an input. And then there's a storage warehouse for all of the outputs, and they have a number associated with them. And that's the signal coming along here, that as this number goes down, first the highest priority setups will run. So with aluminum, it's set to 8,000. So whenever this warehouse goes below 8,000, the aluminum will run. And because it's an output, the numbers are reversed. So instead, the high priority methods have the highest numbers. So then let's look for a lower priority method of making aluminum. And I'm just looking at them, and here we go. This is the green, which is on this side. This is the Givelite chunk sorting, that when the number goes from 8 to 6,000, then this method turns on. So the least desirable method will have the lowest number. It still needs to have a control, because otherwise it would be on all the time. But it would have the lowest number. So to figure this, you basically need to go through each possible way of making a resource and basically creating a list with some kind of integer to them. So with these, we were doing the integer of 2,000. So every new resource type that is better than the one that came before is 2,000 higher on the list. So I can tell that there were only 4 methods of making aluminum because the number was 8,000. Resources that have a lot more ways of making them have numbers that are a lot higher because there's more potential options for them. So let's walk all the way down. I don't want to fly because the robots are like delivering resources, so I'm walking. But let's go with iron. Iron is set to 22,000. That's because there's something at 20, there's something at 18, 16, 14, 12, 10, and so on. And that's kind of how that works. So whenever you add more resource types to this, you're going to need to make this number higher or have like intermediate numbers. And to make it easier to understand, I would prefer just to rewrite these numbers. So basically, you need to calculate each one individually and figure that out. So let's figure out iron, and it's probably easiest just to like write it down on a piece of paper. But for the purposes of the video, let's use some combinators here. And we start with the least desirable method, and actually we're probably going to have more methods than this. So maybe we should like put them over here. But we can search for iron. And then we look at the product of to see where they all come from. And you can see how there's so many ways to get iron. You probably don't need to have the same level of granularity that I have, but this setup has worked pretty well, and since you have all these different methods of producing ores, you might as well have a logic to control them all. And some of them are better than others, so they might as well be sorted. Going from the least desirable to the most desirable might be kind of hard to understand, so let's go from most to least, and then we'll put the numbers in. So hopefully that'll make sense. Well, when it comes to making iron, And when I talk about what's most and least desirable, it's basically about the byproducts. That if our goal is to make iron, is Givelite crystals a good way of making iron? It's alright. But the thing is out of 8 input crystals, we only get 3 iron, and the rest of it is, it's not junk, but we don't need it right now. We want iron. So the best way for the factory to run is to only produce the resource you actually want, like iron. But the reason why we have these other setups is because it's possible that the input requirements will not be met for this method to run. And if we only had this method, it meant that iron just stops until the correct input is achieved. So by having multiple sources of iron, it allows the factory to be flexible based on different conditions. And that's kind of how you see that these ores, the ones that aren't 30,000 anyway, because that's a set number, are constantly fluctuating up and down, sometimes pretty severely. But this bus has never clogged because it doesn't allow itself to. And it's basically been hands-off that we have all these sorting types and we've never had to mess with it because the logic has controlled it for us. But still, the most desirable method of making iron is the direct sorting. It does require the mineral catalyst, but it's 100% efficient for the resources that go in. It has no byproducts, which makes it the best. So we can kind of come in here, and we actually want them to be the recipe, which would be kind of annoying because it's everything in there. So we'll grab that the recipe for iron ore is the best. And it might be easier just to look at the unlocked recipes we have rather than that list, because there's some that we haven't unlocked yet. So if iron's the best, what comes next? Well, it's probably going to be the ferrous, because it adds a lot of iron and a lot of manganese. Now, yes, manganese is a byproduct, but the manganese can go straight into making more iron with a 100% efficiency. For practical purposes, I would consider that manganese is iron. And manganese is essentially a byproduct, but we can also produce it. I think we're treating it like a byproduct right now, so we might want to consider if we want it to be that or actually produce it as its own legitimate resource. Because these manganese ingots can be combined with steel, iron, aluminum, and titanium to drastically reduce the amount of input resources. Now, it's most productive with steel because steel requires a ton of iron. So not a ton of manganese will double the output, which is really good. Of course, it doubles the output of iron, doubles the output of aluminum, and probably really importantly will double the output of titanium when we can't make very much of it right now. So we might actually want to consider just making manganese a permanent resource that we have. But nonetheless, for the purposes of iron, we only want to consider iron. We know that if our goal is to make iron, we're also going to benefit from having manganese, so we might as well consider that. So here's another example where you might think, well, the best, highest tier of ore processing is the best. Well, not really, because if our goal is iron, and our input is 8 dust, 6 of it, 4 being iron and 2 being manganese, will turn into our iron that we want. But then we're going to have a nickel and a cobalt, which is unrelated to the output that we want. And if we did ferrous powder, that's better. We get 3 iron and 2 manganese, but we still get a nickel, which is less desirable. And going further down into tier 1, with just crushed mixture, we get 2 iron and 2 manganese, which is 100% efficient as far as making iron. And I would argue that this is almost better than making it the normal sorting method, because this requires the mineral catalyst, while the mixtures does not. But the mixtures does require that the manganese be processed, and if that manganese is being consumed for other processes as well, then it means it won't actually all go towards iron, so it is slightly worse in that sense. So the very best way of these 3 is the mixture, and then it will be powder, and then it'll be dust. They're all actually really good methods of making iron. Just technically, this one's the best. So we'll go to ferrous. Recipe crushed ferrous. And the only reason why we have these things here is for visual reasons. Don't actually need to do this for anything. just trying to explain how this process goes if you're curious about how I came up with the numbers. So we have our 4 best ways of making iron now, but oh, there are more. We now have to go through all of these. And if you look at the crystal sorting methods, the ones that create iron still create a lot of junk. So if we wanted to use sapphirite crystals, we'd only get 3 out of the 8 of them being iron, and the rest of them would be junk. So all of those sorting methods are kind of bad. And then we go down, where instead of 3 out of 8, it's 2 out of 6, which is still kind of bad. So then the crushed methods are best. So if we did crushed sapphirite or crushed givelite, we would get 50% of the input being iron. And 50% is still worse than even the worst dust sorting method that we have, which is still quite good. So it kind of shows you how much worse it gets and how quickly it gets worse. So 50% is pretty good. And then we have crushed steatite ore, but that's only 25% efficient, which is really bad. So we probably don't even want to consider those right now. And of the two, both of these are the same level of efficiency. Crushed sapphirite and crushed givelite, both are 50%. But givelite is a slightly rarer resource than sapphirite is. So our priority should probably be sapphirite. So we do our crushed sapphirite as the next best way. And then crushed givelite as the next best way from there. And now we are at 50% efficiency. So let's look at some of the other methods that create iron. Well, certainly it wouldn't want to be steatite or crotinium because those are even worse than 25%. So if we did sapphirite chunks, it is now 2 out of 6, so 33%. And if we did crystals, it's 3 out of 8, which is slightly better than 33%. So strictly from a material standpoint, the crystals are actually better than the chunks, at least when it comes to return on the input resources. And by prioritizing the crystals over the chunks, it will create some extra titanium and cobalt or any of the other rare resources, which this is the only way to make this stuff right now. So we kind of want to prioritize the methods that do that, but it's not that much different when you look at, with sapphirite chunks, it's 2 iron, 1 copper, a silicon, and a nickel. Really the only difference with crystals is we get an extra iron and an extra titanium. We still get the same amount of everything else out of it. So crystals being slightly better, of these two, which ones do we want? It kind of depends on those byproducts. Which ones are least desirable and which ones are most desirable. So nickel is less desirable as a byproduct, but titanium is pretty good. And on givelite, zinc is a better byproduct. Aluminum is a better byproduct than silicon is. And I would say that cobalt is probably better than titanium right now. We need a lot of both, but we're going to need a ton of cobalt just for all of our blue belts and inserters. So I would say that givelite is the superior option there. So it would be givelite crystals and then sapphirite crystals. So sorting the givelite, then sorting the sapphirite crystals. So now we've gone through there. And then slightly behind those is the chunks with the 33% efficiency. And between these two, it's probably the same, where nickel is useful, but we've kind of had nickel overload in the past. If you look at our resources even right now, we have 60,000 nickel ore, when 80,000 is technically the maximum where it shuts things down. It's always kind of hard to use up nickel. It gets sucked up with Science Cost Tweaker mod making military packs, which I think is one of the advantages of that mod, is it actually gives you something to use all your nickel on. So nickel is kind of a difficult byproduct to deal with. But zinc goes into lots of things. And certainly aluminum is a major thing as well. So I would say that givelite chunks are better than the sapphirite chunks. So we'll come down here. We'll do our givelite chunk and sapphirite chunk. So now we have iron with direct sorting with catalysts, and then the 3 tiers of ferrous, and then the 3 tiers of sapphirite and givelite. And those are like the air quotes good and decent ways of making it. Now we're starting to get into the trash tier ways of making iron. Bodmonium and rubite don't make any iron at all, so we don't have to worry about those. Now it's just stearite and crotinium. So with just the crushed versions, we would get a 25% return, which is bad, but it's not that much worse than 33%, so... and we're getting iron as a result, which is something we need a lot of, so it's not the worst way in the world of doing it. And then chunks gets even worse, so instead of 1 out of 4, now we're getting 1 out of 6 if we did chunks with either of these, so those are definitely worse. And then it gets even worse with crystals because it's 1 out of 8. So here's kind of an example where this stuff isn't particularly symmetrical when it comes to which way is better than others. You actually need to kind of consider everything individually to figure out how you want to do it. Because before, we were like, hey, sapphirite crystals are better than sapphirite chunks. And that is not the case when it comes to the crotinium and stearite ways of making iron. So the best way of these terrible ways is stearite and crotinium. The output is the same, but crotinium is slightly rarer than stearite is, so we should probably prioritize crotinium. And running out of spaces here. I know we have these things on the bus, but I think it'd be easier just to place a bunch of them there. So crushed stearite, and then crushed crotinium. It's the next best ways. And iron is probably the most complicated of all of these just because iron comes from so many different sources, and copper too. So when you're going down the list to the harder resources to create, you won't have to calculate so many things. But I suppose showing you the worst case scenario of all of the calculations you have to do is probably the best example of how I kind of process this, at least in my head. So we go from 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 6 with the chunks. And between these two, which one is better? Well, silver and tin are pretty useful. Lead is less useful. Aluminum is more useful, but I'm kind of worried about the lead getting overloaded. Whereas silver is kind of a rare resource, and tin we need a ton of. So I feel like stearite is slightly better than crotinium. Then again, they're also very close on the list, where we have all of these things, these processing methods, so it doesn't really make that much a difference to have like their positions slightly changed, because both of them are trash tier near the bottom of the list anyway for making iron. So it kind of doesn't really matter either way. They're both bad. And then, out of all of the methods that we have to create iron, the absolute worst 2 ways of making it is with crystals, because we only get 1 iron for every 8 crystals that go in. And between these two, which one is better? Well, the resources they create are basically the same, except we get a uranium or a titanium. And between the two of those, which one do we want to focus on? They're both bad. I would say that titanium is probably the more useful resource than uranium is. But uranium is easier to get rid of because we can just use it as fuel, where titanium is not that case. Not to mention that the titanium will also come with some lead as well, which I'm worried about using compared to silver and tin, which gets used a ton. Because copper, silver, and tin all go into wires, and it's very easy to get rid of by comparison. So I would say the stearite crystals is next, and then the very worst is crotinium crystals. And then there we go. We don't need anything here. And then that's all of our methods. So from worst to best for making iron, at least according to our analysis here, is crotinium crystals, stearite crystals, crotinium chunks, stearite chunks, crushed crotinium, crushed stearite, sapphirite chunks, givolite chunks, sapphirite crystals, givolite crushed, sapphirite crushed, and then the ferrous dust, ferrous powder, crushed ferrous mixture, and then finally the direct sorting. Those are all of our methods. So we needed to create this in a list because remember that the highest priority method has the highest number. And if you want it to be kind of consistent, it needs to start from the bottom. So this first one, we can come in here and say it's enabled when we're under 2000. And since that is our increment, it means each one can go up by 2,000. So basically what it is if the iron warehouse is lower than 2,000, this method turns on. And then it's just a question of coming through here. And you wouldn't need to do any of this. I'm just doing it to be visual. So it's probably a little more work for me to do it this way, but I kind of just wanted to visually show it rather than reading it off. So we should have all of the numbers in here to give you an idea. So these numbers are just how high the iron warehouse needs to be for these to shut off. Or in other words, maybe a better way of saying it would be, how low does the iron warehouse need to be for them to turn on? So the very best method is direct sorting, and it needs the warehouse to be below 32,000. So as long as it's above 32,000, it won't turn on and everything is fine. It's when it goes below. So when it goes below 30,000, crushed ferrous will turn on. Then below 28,000, ferrous powder. Below 26,000, ferrous dust. And so on and so on. So as the number gets lower, the factory gets more and more desperate, turning on the worse and worse methods. Meanwhile, all of the better methods are still on until it gets to the very bottom, which requires that the warehouse be below 2,000 or essentially empty for the very worst method to turn on. And all of these methods will also have their inputs being controlled, so it won't just be Wild West of all of these resources just being sent all over the place and just hoping that they turn on. That the best methods will still get priority of where the resources go. So it will fix itself over time and balance out. So that's the value of having both the inputs and the outputs with their own logic. So then how would you go about setting all these? Well, you definitely need to write it down, and it's kind of monotonous to do it. So I don't necessarily want to have a giant episode of me running around just changing circuit networks. But I did want to show how you would do one, and then I can just do it off camera and say, look, it's done now, because now you know how to do it, and then you can look in the comments or whatever for the exact numbers that I ended up coming up with. But we need to disable these warehouses, because if we start changing numbers, we're going to start seeing things flow, and we kind of want to wait for the entire thing to be set up first before we do that. And that's kind of the whole point of these combinators here. And actually 30,000 is not a high enough number, because potentially it would react to being below 32,000. So let's do like 35,000. And when we turn it on, it sets it to 35,000 regardless of what the warehouse does. And when we set all of these, every single signal is going to say 35,000. And any material requests will just happen until the resources run out. And nothing will ever get replaced, because regardless of what the warehouse actually has, up to and including 0, it will say 35,000 and produce nothing. So there we go. 35,000s for everything. So basically how you would configure this is, ideally you would have just written it down somewhere instead of having to refer to a physical entity in the game. But you just go through each sorting method of iron and just adjust the associated combinator. So the best way is direct sorting, and it needs to be 32,000. And it's right here. This is the direct sorting method. So we come in here and it says it needs to be below 22. So we set it to 32,000, and that's that. It's a little more complicated when you have more sorting types to go through. So one thing you can do is, as long as these combinators are set correctly to the resources that come out of that particular thing, you can just kind of go down and find the associated combinator. And we have one here for the crushed ferrous mixture, and it is one of our methods, and it's 30,000. So you come here and say 30,000, and that's the green signal. The greens are the go signals. That's the thing we actually want to change. The stop signals are all 80,000, so that doesn't really need to be changed for anything. And another thing you can do to check your work is just look at what's on the belt and see, do you see iron or the thing you're trying to adjust? Well, then that means there's a combinator somewhere that you need to adjust. And it is there. So we'll just keep walking through, look for iron. We found it. It's at the crushed sapphirite. So we come here, find the crushed sapphirite, wherever it is in our list. It's right there. And we determined it is 24,000. And that's right here. So instead of 16, it's 24,000. And then we keep going. We see some iron on the belt. We see some iron on the combinators. This one is crushed givelite. So we come over here. Crushed givelite is right there. And it is 22,000. So we keep going and we have iron on each side because these are the terrible methods of making it. The one on the top is the crotinium. So let's check crotinium. Crushed crotinium is 10,000. So we come up here, make this 10,000. It kind of makes sense that the original numbers aren't that much different than what we have now, because their positions in the list shouldn't change too much. Just what exactly the numbers so happen to be. And then our crushed stereotype is 12,000. Come up here, say 12,000. Then we keep going. Looking for iron. We found some. This is the ferrous powder. And the ferrous powder is 28,000. Then we keep going. And we found some again. It's for these sapphirite chunks. So sapphirite chunks is 14,000. Then do a little bit of walking and we have 2 of them that make it. Let's go with the one on the top here first, which is the stereotype. Stereotype chunks are 8,000. And then the givelite chunks are 16,000. And then we've got increasingly small amounts of iron here, but there's a little bit on this one. That is the crotinium chunks. So crotinium chunks is 6,000. That was previously, because it was set to 2,000, the very worst way of making iron. But now we've got even worse ways of doing it. And all of these combinators need to actually be set correctly. So they should be set to the resources that particular sorting method makes. And the way it just so happens to be is that it's a little backwards, but that the bottom row is for the line on the right and the top row is for the line on the left. So we need to set all this. And I try to just do it in the order that it is on the menu because it makes a little bit more sense. A little monotonous, a little grindy to do this, but that's kind of how circuit networks tend to be sometimes, is there's a lot of different settings you have to make sure you've got set. So I wanted to show how to do this at least for one thing. And then once you know, you can extrapolate what occurred off camera. Okay, I think we've got all of these hooked up now. You'll notice that some of them are slightly different because there's only 4 outputs instead of 5, so one less combinator. Try to get all the wires hooked up so hopefully nothing's broken, and also a few less lights. But now these all have the exact resources that will be produced by each line, so we can continue setting up iron. And we've got iron on both of these lines, iron both on the combinators, so with crotinium crystals, go all the way to the bottom. It is 2,000. Worst way possible. And just so happens to already be set to that, so that's good. So now we need to do the sapphirite crystals. And they're a lot higher. 18,000. So there's our 18,000. So move to the next one. Looks like we do have some iron on both sides. They're kind of hard to see, but they're down here. So we definitely have iron. We have 2 irons here. So one of them is the givelite crystals. And givelite crystals are one of the better ones at 20,000. And then we have the ferrous powder, which is also one of the better ones at 26,000. So there we go, 26,000. We'll keep moving. Do we see any iron? Not really. Don't see any iron up here. Makes sense. Let's keep going. Last lines. Do we see iron? Yeah, a little bit on the stereotype. And it's in the combinators. So stereotype is one of the worst ones at 4,000. So we'll change that to 4,000. And that's basically the process for setting this stuff up. So we have like 14 ores we need to do that, but luckily, the more rarer the resource, the less configuration that actually needs to be done, because there's just less ways of making it. But I wanted to show the most complicated way, so you kind of have an idea of how that works. And the numbers won't match because it's from least desirable to most, so some, like iron, the numbers go really high because there's so many different ways of making it. But some of the rarer things, let's say like silver, the highest it goes, at least the old setup, was 8,000. So that's kind of how that works. At even as their goal, they won't have the same level. They'll all balance out to different numbers. And that's just to make it easier. I mean, we could make each warehouse exactly the same, but then it requires a little more math, because like down here, we had it to where all of the input warehouses held 1,000. And basically we just divided the number of conditions to figure out. So like Bobmonium had 4 potential conditions, so we knew to increment it by units of 250. But let's say you have 13 different methods of handling a resource. Well, then it gets really annoying, even as the tiniest resource input was required, like a train comes through, because usually when trains come through, they just completely annihilate these things, and the level goes way lower than the set point, which is fine. That the lower it goes, the more and more this thing just fills up with junk until it finally maximizes. But the design of this isn't that only the best ways will run, because it's just not possible. Like, we've seen this quite a bit when our factory's been handling iron. We have 3 output belts of iron, and even then, that's technically not enough when a train comes through. So this only having 2 belts of input means that if all 3 of those are getting used, that extra belt's going to have to come from somewhere, and it's not going to be here. So it's fine. You know, it all balances out, and it doesn't look like it right now because all these numbers are the same, but that's how that works. And this little bit on the end, haven't really mentioned it in a long time. This is just a junk catcher. So if any of these are set incorrectly and they don't pull a resource they should, we will have resources that get to the very end and are just junk. Like, let's say Biter's attack, and then all the orbs drop on these belts and go everywhere. Well, they would eventually get sucked into here because none of these splitters would take them. Then we would know that something was messed up. So that's why those are there, but essentially always empty. They're just a catch. So I guess I will handle the other ores now, and I won't do it like this. I'll just write it down so I don't have to handle it in this way, because this is not the most friendly way of doing it, but hopefully it made a little more sense to you as a viewer what I was doing, rather than me just reading numbers out. So I will get on this. We'll be back in a bit. And that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we are going to talk a little bit about uranium and do some other little factory fixes that we still need to take care of before we can flip the switches and all of this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.